the story begins in silence. The Appalachian Mountains are not merely hills of stone and trees. They are vaults of memory, heavy with secrets too dark to bear the light. Travelers who dared wander too deep into the hollows spoke of whispers strange, shapes on the ridgeline, cabins where no smoke should rise, shadows that lingered too long in the corners of their vision. And in these whispers, one name surfaced again and again: the Whitakers, a family spoken not in conversation, but in warning, a family whose blood was said to twist against itself, generation after generation, until their very bodies bore the mark of their isolation. The Whitakers lived where the dirt roads ended and the mountains swallowed the sky. Their cabin leaned, like a rotting tooth against the hillside, wood blackened by rain and time. The door sagged on its hinges, windows stared blankly into the wilderness, patched with scraps of cloth instead of glass. For years, outsiders passed it by with hushed dread. For years, neighbors whispered of screams that were not animal and not quite human, carried down the valley on the wind. It began with silence, and then it became something more. Children of the hills were told never to wander near the Whitakers' land, never to follow the creek that wound like a black serpent through the pines, because it would lead them there to the cabin where the family lived in shadow. Men in town remembered hunting dogs that would not cross the property line, whimpering and clawing against their leashes, tails tucked in terror. Women remembered figures seen in the distance, watching, unmoving, eyes glinting faintly in the dusk, like the eyes of deer, and yet no one came close. Not because they did not wonder, but because they feared what they might find. The Whitakers were said to be more than just inbred. Their story was not simply of kin binding themselves to kin, but of hunger that drove them to break every boundary of flesh and blood. There were rumors of bones found in shallow pits, picked clean as if by wolves, but without wolves' teeth. Rumors of travelers gone missing, their wagons left abandoned on the road. No lawman ever dared follow the trail, no preacher ever braved their hollow. The Whitakers existed like a sickness at the edge of the map. Everyone knew, no one intervened. Inside, their cabin life was marked by shadow. Generations folded into each other. A father became a husband, a sister became a wife, an uncle became a patriarch. Boundaries collapsed until bloodline and household were the same word. In the dim light of oil lamps, children were born pale and twisted, their limbs crooked, their eyes staring too long and too wide. The mountains kept their screams hidden, muffled beneath the pines. And hunger, always hunger. Crops withered in the stony soil. Deer grew scarce. Winters bit deep and long. The Whitakers survived, as they always had, by feeding not just on what the forest offered, but on what disappeared into it. It was said they lured wanderers with promises of shelter, with faint voices calling from the trees. It was said they ate what no man should eat, and in doing so, became something less and something more than human. Neighbors recalled the smell that carried on the wind smoke from fires that smelled not of wood, nor of venison, but of something heavier, sweeter, unbearable once it was recognized. They closed their doors, barred their shutters, and prayed that the Whitakers would remain in their hollow, content to feast only when desperate. But silence does not last forever. One autumn, hunters found strange shapes near the creek bed, bones, scattered like fallen branches, a boot still laced, but with no foot within it, and claw marks, no, not claws, finger marks, gouged deep into the bark of trees, as if someone had tried to crawl their way out of the forest itself. The whispers grew louder. The Whitakers became not just a family, but a curse. Parents warned their children that to stray too far into the woods was to invite the Whitakers' gaze. Men swore they had heard voices echoing in the trees, calling their names in tones that almost sounded familiar. Women whispered of pale figures glimpsed at the edges of firelight, crouched low, watching, waiting, still. No one went to the cabin. No one demanded answers. Because in Appalachia, some truths were better left buried in the earth. where the roots might choke them silent. The Whitakers' world was one of secrets, the kind that rot in silence, until silence itself becomes unbearable. And so the hollow where they lived grew darker with each passing year, until the family was less a group of people than a living legend of fear. And yet, this was only the beginning. Asterisk, if the first whispers of the Whitakers were born of silence, the next came from sounds no one wished to hear, yet could not forget at night. When the mountains fell into blackness, travelers swore they heard knocking, not on their doors, but from the trees themselves. 3 heavy thuds, as though something inside the forest wished to be let out. Some claimed it was the wind twisting through hollow trunks, but others said it was the Whitakers, marking their presence, reminding the valley that hunger had no curfew. One winter, a merchant passing through the ridgeline vanished. His mule was found days later, tied to a tree, ribs jutting like splinters. Of the man, there was no trace. Townsfolk said nothing aloud, but in every hearthlit room, the same conclusion burned in silence. The Whitakers had fed again. The family themselves rarely showed their faces beyond their hollow. When they did, the sight lingered in memory like a stain. Gaunt figures, pale as the moon, eyes that darted like cornered animals. Some children never spoke again after glimpsing them. Men described bodies twisted by time and blood, features blurred as if sculpted and resculpted by unsteady hands. They walked with uneven gaits, muttering in voices cracked and broken, speaking words that were not fully words, and yet there was something worse than their bodies, their silence. The Whitakers looked through others, as if measuring the weight of their flesh, as if deciding whether to act now or later. It was said they carried no coin, no goods for trade, only bones and hides too strange to name. The townspeople tolerated their shadow, but tolerance is a brittle wall, and hunger is a hammer. In the spring of 1897, a girl disappeared from a neighboring valley. She had been seen gathering herbs along the creek, humming softly to herself. When she did not return, search parties formed. They combed the woods, calling her name until their throats bled raw. All they found was her basket, overturned, herbs scattered like offerings before some unseen altar. The trail of her bare feet led toward the Whitakers' hollow, and there it stopped. No one entered. No one dared. For weeks, her family wept in silence, and the mountains carried their grief. But grief soon turned to rage, and rage to trembling resolve. A group of men, fueled by sorrow and drink, swore to march to the Whitaker cabin. They left at dusk, torches in hand, voices loud to mask their fear. They said they would bring the girl home, more bring vengeance if they could not. By dawn, only one man returned. His torch was gone. His clothes were torn, his face ashen hollow, ruined by something beyond words. He could not speak of what he saw. He only whispered one sentence, over and over, until his voice gave out. It was not human. After that night, no one else tried. The Whitakers became untouchable, not because they were unseen, but because they were too present, too undeniable. They were a wound in the flesh of Appalachia that no one dared clean. The lawmen avoided their hollow. The preachers never spoke their name in sermons. Parents taught their children to pray at night not to God, but to the mountain, begging it to keep the Whitakers away. And yet, the family endured. They grew. They multiplied in their own way, binding themselves closer and closer, until their very blood became a prison. Some said they could no longer leave, even if they wished, that the hollow itself had claimed them, holding them fast like roots clutching stone. Their hunger kept them alive, but their hunger also trapped them, forever bound to the shadows they had made. Still, stories leaked. A hunter, lost in the woods, claimed he stumbled too close and saw the cabin by firelight. He swore he saw bones hanging from the rafters, skulls lined like trophies along the walls. He swore he heard chewing in the dark, slow and deliberate, like teeth grinding marrow. He ran until his legs failed him, and he never set foot in those woods again. Whether he spoke truth or fevered terror, no one asked. In Appalachia, stories were often truer than facts, and so, the legend of the Whitakers deepened not a family, but a curse of flesh, not merely inbred, but consumed by their own hunger, twisting them into creatures more myth than human. And yet, they lived, generation after generation, their cabin sagging deeper, their hollow darker, their bloodline coiled tighter with each birth. The question grew heavier, whispered not just in fear but in awe. How long could such a family survive? How far could hunger carry them before they vanished into something else entirely? The mountains did not answer. They never do. The Whitaker Hollow was not marked on maps. It did not need to be. The silence around it was map enough. Travelers instinctively walked faster when the air grew still, when even birds would not sing. And always, just before the ridge, there came the smell, something faint, metallic, sour, carried on the wind. The smell of rot. Those who lived closest swore that the hollow never truly slept. In winter, when snow buried the hills in stillness, smoke still rose from the Whitaker chimney, black and thick, curling like a serpent into the night. Children were told not to follow it with their eyes, lest the family see them through the smoke and remember the warmth of human flesh. Years blurred into decades. But the Whitakers did not vanish. Families moved away, farms emptied, churches closed their doors, but the hollow endured, and so did its keepers. With each passing generation, their bodies grew more marked by blood's confinement ties that wandered in different directions. Jaws that hung too loose, voices that barked more than spoke. Yet, despite their brokenness, or perhaps because of it, they persisted. The hollow was their prison. The hollow was their kingdom. By the 1930s, wanderers spoke of children in the Whitaker line who could not speak at all, only grunt or howl, of men who moved on all fours, quicker than deer, of women whose faces bore such strange, uneven features that they seemed carved from driftwood. The townsfolk whispered that God himself had turned his face away, leaving them to be reshaped by hunger alone. Still, they survived. No blight, no famine, no sheriff's visit could erase them. They were bound not by faith, nor by law, but by blood and appetite. And then, as if the mountain had grown weary of its own secret, stories began to fade. Fewer sightings, fewer whispers. It was not that the Whitakers were gone, it was that the valley learned to forget them, to lock their name away like a family shame too deep to confess. But sometimes, in the right kind of silence, the stories returned. A hiker swore he saw a figure crouched at the edge of the tree line watching. A fisherman found bones near the creek, too large for animals, too fragile for stone. A hunter's dog vanished into the woods, never to be seen again, save for its collar, left on a stump like an offering. The Whitakers were not gone. They had merely melted into the marrow of Appalachia, inseparable from its soil, its shadows, its silence. And so their legend grew, passed not in sermons or books, but in murmurs at the edge of campfires, and warnings whispered to children. The Whitakers became less a family than a question: what happens when blood loops in on itself? What happens when hunger replaces faith, when silence becomes the only inheritance? Perhaps they are still there, crouched in their hollow, chewing slow, waiting for the next lost traveler. Or perhaps they have seeped into the earth, their blood now, the very veins of the mountain, ensuring their hunger will never end. The truth is not written. It lingers only in dread, and if you ever walk too far into the hollows of Appalachia, and you feel the silence press against your chest, heavy and unbroken, listen carefully. If you hear chewing, faint and steady, turn back. Do not run. Do not call out. Just walk away, before the mountain remembers your name. Because some families are never meant to be forgotten. The Whitakers may be buried in shadow, but their name has not died. Their story lives in silence, in whispers carried by the wind, in fears the mountains never let go. What we uncovered tonight is only one thread in a vast, hidden tapestry of America's darkest secrets. If this tale chilled you, know there are more stories buried, silenced, erased, waiting for light. Subscribe, share, and walk with us into the forgotten corners of history, because the past does not stay buried. It waits,